Snow had been falling over the valley since early morning, covering the ranch in a quiet, white blanket that made the world feel forgotten. The wind moved slowly through the wooden fences and bare trees, carrying the sharp cold that only came in the deep weeks of winter. The ranch house stood alone at the edge of the land, a small wooden cabin with smoke drifting lazily from the chimney. Inside that cabin lived Daniel Harper, a widowed rancher who had spent the last 3 Christmases alone. Daniel stood near the small kitchen table staring at a dusty wooden box sitting in front of him. Inside the box were a few Christmas decorations his wife once loved. A red ribbon, a small glass ornament shaped like a star, and a tiny wooden angel their daughter had carved years ago. He hadn't opened the box in a long time. The room was quiet except for the slow crackling of the fire in the stone fireplace. Outside, the wind pushed snow against the cabin walls, but Daniel barely noticed. His large, rough hands rested on the edge of the table as he stared at the wooden angel. "Mary used to hang this one first," he murmured to the empty room. Mary had died 4 winters ago during a fever that swept through the valley. Their daughter Sarah had followed a year later when sickness reached the ranch again. Since then, the ranch had been quiet. Too quiet. Daniel finally closed the box and pushed it aside. Christmas didn't feel like something meant for a man living alone on a forgotten ranch. He stood up slowly and grabbed his coat from the chair beside the door. The cattle still needed checking before nightfall. Winter didn't pause for holidays. The door creaked open and a blast of cold air rushed inside. Snow swirled across the porch in thick, white waves. Daniel stepped outside and pulled his hat lower over his brow. The valley stretched wide and empty beneath the gray sky. Then he saw something that didn't belong there, a figure near the front gate. At first he thought it was just a shadow in the snow, but the shadow moved. Slowly, weakly. Daniel narrowed his eyes and walked down the path toward the gate. As he got closer, he saw it clearly. A young woman stood there, barely holding herself upright. Her coat was thin and worn, dusted with snow that had begun to freeze along the edges. Her dark hair clung to her cheeks, and her hands trembled from the cold. She looked no older than 20. Daniel stopped a few steps away from her. "You lost?" he asked in a calm, rough voice. The girl lifted tired eyes toward him. There was fear in them, but also something else. Determination. She swallowed hard before speaking. "I ain't got nowhere to go, sir, but I can cook." Her voice was quiet, almost carried away by the wind. Daniel stared at her for a moment. Of all the things he expected a stranger to say on his land, that wasn't one of them. "You walked here?" he asked. She nodded slowly. "From where?" "The road." "The road's 15 miles from here." Another slow nod. Snow continued falling around them. The girl's boots were soaked through, and her fingers had turned red from the cold. She looked like she had been walking for hours, maybe longer. Daniel sighed quietly and looked out across the empty valley. Out here, people didn't just appear on Christmas without a reason. "What's your name?" he asked. "Lily." Daniel studied her face carefully. She looked exhausted, hungry, and frozen to the bone. "You running from someone, Lily?" She hesitated just long enough to answer the question without speaking. Daniel noticed, but instead of pushing further, he stepped aside and opened the gate. "Well," he said gruffly, "you can't stand out here freezing." Lily blinked in surprise. "You mean?" "I mean get inside before the wind decides to finish the job." Relief washed across her face so quickly, it almost made Daniel uncomfortable. She stepped through the gate carefully, like she wasn't sure the offer was real. The two of them walked back toward the cabin. When they stepped inside, the warmth from the fireplace wrapped around Lily like a blanket. She stopped just inside the doorway, her shoulders shaking slightly as the cold finally began leaving her body. Daniel closed the door and hung his coat on the hook beside it. "There's stew on the stove," he said. "Wasn't planning on sharing it today, but looks like Christmas had other ideas." Lily stepped slowly toward the kitchen area. The smell alone made her stomach tighten with hunger. "Thank you," she whispered. Daniel handed her a bowl and watched quietly as she began eating. She tried to eat politely at first, but hunger quickly won the battle. He sat down across from her at the table. "You really can cook?" he asked. Lily nodded while finishing a spoonful. "Yes, sir." "You ever run a ranch kitchen?" "No, sir, but I learned fast." Daniel leaned back in his chair, studying her. The ranch had been empty for too long. The kitchen hadn't smelled like fresh food in years. After a moment, he said, "You can stay a few days until the storm clears." Lily looked up quickly. "Really?" "Long as you're willing to cook." A small, hopeful smile appeared on her face for the first time. "I can do that." Daniel nodded once, but as he looked out the window toward the snow-covered valley, something caught his attention. Far out near the distant ridge, a dark shape moved slowly through the snow. A rider. Daniel's expression hardened slightly. Strangers didn't ride this far out unless they had a reason. He looked back at Lily, who was quietly finishing her bowl of stew, unaware of the distant figure approaching the ranch. Daniel turned his eyes toward the window again. The rider had stopped on the ridge, watching the cabin from far away through the falling snow. And Daniel Harper suddenly had the feeling that Lily's arrival on Christmas Day might not be the quiet miracle it first appeared to be. He kept his eyes on the ridge for several seconds. The rider sat still against the gray sky, barely moving while snow drifted around him. From that distance, Daniel couldn't see the man's face, but the horse and rider were clearly watching the ranch. Daniel slowly pulled the curtain halfway across the window. "Storm's getting worse," he said calmly as he turned back toward the table. Lily nodded softly while finishing the last of the stew. The warmth had brought some color back into her cheeks, but the tiredness in her eyes remained. "You can sleep in the spare room," Daniel said. "Door down the hallway." Lily looked up with surprise again, as if kindness still felt unfamiliar to her. "I won't cause trouble, sir," she said quietly. Daniel gave a short, dry chuckle. "Trouble usually finds its way out here without needing help." Lily lowered her eyes again. Something in that simple sentence made her uneasy. Daniel stood up and added another log to the fire. The flames rose higher, filling the cabin with warm orange light. Outside, the snowstorm thickened, and the valley slowly disappeared into white fog. After a moment, Lily spoke again. "You said this is your ranch?" "Been mine 15 years. "Just you?" Daniel nodded once. "My wife used to run this kitchen better than I ever could," he said quietly. "Christmas was her favorite day." Lily hesitated before asking softly, "What happened?" Daniel stared into the fire for a moment before answering. "Winter fever," he said, "took her fast." Silence filled the room again. Lily finally whispered, "I'm sorry." Daniel shrugged slightly, though his eyes stayed on the fire. It was a long time ago. But even as he said it, the empty feeling in the house made it clear the time hadn't really changed much. Outside, the rider on the ridge finally moved again. The horse turned slowly and disappeared behind the snowy hill. Daniel noticed. That worried him more than the watching. Watching meant patience. Leaving meant action. He walked to the door and stepped out onto the porch for a moment. The wind hit him hard and cold, but he barely noticed. His eyes scanned the distant hills where the rider had vanished. "Whoever you belong to," Daniel muttered under his breath, "you picked the wrong ranch." He stepped back inside and closed the door. Lily was standing near the fire now, warming her hands. "Everything all right?" she asked carefully. Daniel nodded. "Just checking the weather." But Lily had already learned enough about men on the road to know when someone was lying to protect her. She looked down at the floor quietly. "I didn't mean to bring trouble here," she said. Daniel paused. Then he looked at her with calm, steady eyes. "You didn't bring winter either," he said, "but it still shows up." Lily didn't know what to say to that. Daniel walked past her and opened a small cabinet near the door. Inside rested a worn rifle and a box of ammunition. Lily's breath caught slightly when she saw it. Daniel noticed but said nothing. He simply checked the rifle, then set it beside the door again like a man who had done the same thing 1,000 times before. Best get some sleep, he said. Long day tomorrow. Lily nodded and walked slowly down the hallway toward the spare room. For the first time in weeks, she felt something close to safety. The bed was warm, the cabin was quiet, and the storm outside hid the world beyond the ranch. She fell asleep quickly, but Daniel did not sleep that night. He sat in the wooden chair beside the fire with the rifle resting across his knees. The flames slowly burned lower while the wind howled across the valley. Hours passed. Then sometime after midnight, the horses in the barn began to move restlessly. Daniel's eyes opened immediately. A faint sound carried through the storm. Hoofbeats. More than one horse. Daniel stood silently and walked toward the window. Through the blowing snow, he saw 3 dark figures approaching the ranch from the northern trail. The rider from the ridge had not been alone after all. Daniel's jaw tightened. Behind him, Lily slept peacefully down the hallway, unaware that the men she had tried to escape had finally found the ranch. The riders reached the gate and dismounted slowly, their boots crunching into the snow. One of them walked forward and pounded his fist against the wooden fence. "Rancher," a voice shouted through the storm, "we're looking for a girl." Daniel calmly picked up the rifle beside the door. Christmas had just become a very dangerous night.